have a look at understanding our camera. We're going to break down how the camera actually works in our smartphones, because this is going to be very important for you understanding how to capture better photographs. It'll also demystify all of those terms that come along with our smartphones, so that you know exactly what to look for if you are thinking about upgrading your phone as well. So the first thing we're going to have a look at are some common terms that we need to get familiar with in relation to this topic. We're going to talk about our image sensors within our cameras. We'll have a look at our lenses, also very important. The aperture within our lenses as well. We'll talk shutter speeds, ISO, exposure and resolution. I'm sure these are all terms that you may have heard before, and certainly if you are using a camera like a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, you may have come across these terms as well. But they work a little bit differently within our smartphone, so it's really important to understand what we're able to achieve within our smartphones and what our limitations are as well, so that we can get the best out of it too. And the first thing to have a look at, of course, is our image sensor. So imagine we're taking apart our smartphone, something I don't recommend that you do unless you know what you're doing. So we know how our cameras work on our phone, what each of the components do, and why understanding it is going to help improve your photography. So, kicking things off, let's have a look at the image sensor itself. This little device that's located within our cameras. This is where the magic happens. This is where the light is recorded onto the image sensor and creates our photograph. So the light hits our pixels, and through electronic device, it will transvert that light into a photograph that we can see. It'll turn it into a shot, and it really is almost like magic, but in reality it is science. So it's made up of light sensitive pixels. Each of these pixels reacts to light and will capture the different volumes, the different amount of light to make our photograph, to make our exposure. And the sensor captures and records light and electronically creates our digital photograph. Now what the sensor also does, it understands how much time is needed to capture the photograph when we're photographing in our auto modes. So the sensor basically becomes active to the amount of light that it needs to capture the photograph, and will automatically cut that off when our exposure is finished. This is also known as our shutter speed. Certainly something we're going to be speaking about a lot more as we continue on through this lesson, and indeed throughout this course. Now, looking at the second essential component to our cameras is, of course, the lens. This is how our cameras see, therefore how we see, and this is what captures the light. It contains many tiny pieces of glass known as elements. These little elements will take the light rays coming into the phone, and it'll bring them to a point where our image becomes into focus, and it'll also then move that light onto our image sensor. The light is bent through these little elements, allowing us to see through it. It also contains a very important component known as our aperture, which controls the volume of light that is coming in through the lens. Again, something we're going to be speaking a lot about throughout this course. Now, when we put it together, it's all housed in this tiny little device within our phones, and this is indeed our camera. It's a huge amount of technology in a tiny little bit of space. And at the front here, we can very, very clearly see our aperture. So this little opening here is where the light goes through, passes through the lens into the image sensor. This is known as our aperture. An aperture is an opening that allows something to pass through it. So, did you know that great things come in small packages? This is the actual size of the majority of our smartphone cameras and sensors. As you can see, they are absolutely tiny. Now, they do vary in size depending on the type of smartphone that you are using. Some with slightly larger sensors and lenses, as we'll have a look at continuing on throughout the course. But For manufacturers, advancing phone technology, smartphone cameras in particular, is a huge selling point in selling new phones. So the technology is constantly improving to the point where we are capable of capturing professional quality photographs on our smartphones. Now, there are, of course, advantages to using larger cameras with larger sensors. All these things we'll have a look at as we get towards the end of this course. But the advantages with smartphones are just numerous, as we will see, with instant sharing, with the ability to be able to have our phones on us nearly all of the time as well, to always be ready to take a photograph. Now, moving on, let's have a look at the elements of exposure when we are capturing a photograph. So we've had a look at our image sensor, we've had a look at our lenses, but how then does the phone actually control the amount of light that's coming into the camera to create the photograph? Now, when I say exposure, I am speaking about the photograph itself. So if you don't understand what that word means, it's basically when we expose the camera sensor to light, this creates the photograph. So we call it an exposure. And there's three key elements that we use to capture an exposure, and that is light, time, and sensitivity. So light, how much light reaches the sensor, the duration of time that the light hits the sensor, and how sensitive the sensor is to the light itself. Think about it like volume on a stereo. You can turn up the sensitivity and you can turn down the sensitivity of the camera sensor to change in different lighting conditions. So first of all, let's have a look at light and the component that controls light, and that is the aperture, which I've already mentioned is the opening on the front of our lenses, within the lens elements actually, that will allow light to pass through it. And this also has a secondary effect. It controls our depth of field, making that out of focus background that everybody wants to achieve when they're capturing portraits. So it's the opening at the front of the lens, allows light to pass through and reach the camera sensor. It comes in different sizes depending on the phone, but there is kind of a general standard, which we'll speak about in a moment. It is measured in what are called f-stops or f-numbers. This is very important. So you may have seen this before, something like f2.2, which is the standard that I was just talking about for the majority of phones, is f2.2. Don't worry about what the F means for now. We will come back to it. But if you're ever looking at the specs on a phone and you're wondering what that is referring to, it's referring to the size of the aperture within the lens. And as I mentioned, it also controls a secondary component. As well as controlling the amount of light in the photograph, it controls our depth of field. So we can get a nice shallow depth of field, or we can also get a nice deep depth of field if we want to capture a landscape as well. But it cannot be changed, and this is one of the key differences with our phones compared to our cameras, our DSLRs, our mirrorless cameras, is that we cannot change the aperture on a phone. This can make capturing depth of field, shallow depth of field, a little bit tricky, but there is ways to overcome it, as we will see. So moving on then, our second component is our shutter speed, and this controls time. This controls the duration of time that the light hits the image sensor, and this will also control motion in our photographs too, so we can get these really spectacular shots like these light trails here. So determines how long the sensor is exposed to light. In regular cameras, it usually has what's called a focal plane shutter in front of it, like a curtain that will move out of the way to allow light to reach the image sensor. But within our phones, because they're so much smaller, that's removed, and basically the sensor then just becomes active for the amount of time that is needed to expose the image. So it controls motion and it can blur movement. We can also use it to freeze motion as well if we want to capture, these kind of sports photographs where everything is crystal clear and sharp. It is electronic, as I mentioned, so the sensor simply determines how long the exposure is, and it can be controlled in pro and manual mode. So unlike our aperture, it is possible to control our shutter speeds within our phones. Using the pro or the manual mode, we can set how long we want that light to come into the camera, so we can capture motion or we can freeze that motion as well. But there is a caveat to that, because we need to control the exposure, which is what we are going to be working up to. Now, finally then, The third component to our exposures is ISO, which controls sensitivity. And again, this is located within the image sensor itself. And ISO is changed when we need to capture images in low light situations, or we need to use very, very fast shutter speeds. We can make the sensor more sensitive to light, meaning that less light is needed to create the photograph. So in a situation like this, where you're at a concert, there's a lot of light in this image, but it is generally very, very dark. The ISO will increase so that it can get the correct exposure. So it controls the sensitivity to light. It can be increased in lower light situations where there's not a lot of light available, or we can also reduce it when there's too much light, like on very bright days. It is automatically controlled by the camera in most cases, but again, we can also adjust it in pro or manual modes as is needed if we need to add more light. Now, there is also a downside to using higher ISOs. It'll create noise at higher ISO ranges. So when we increase the ISO, we get this kind of texture over the photographs, which is called noise. It's not the same as grain. Grain is something a little bit different. That's something that we would typically find on film because it was using light sensitive crystals. On noise, it's a digital artifact. It's something that's created by the image sensor, the pixel array on the image sensor. And it's something we can manage, however, as well. It's something that we can correct through the use of editing. So when we bring these three elements together, we have what's known as the exposure triangle, a very familiar concept within photography. So we have our light, which is the aperture, we have our time, controlled by the shutter speed, we have our sensitivity, controlled by the ISO. These three components are balanced together to give us our exposure, our photograph. The exposure triangle. And what you're going to find throughout this course, and indeed just with photography in general, it's a little bit of a compromise. We're always trying to balance one thing with the other. Primarily, we should usually look at the aperture and the shutter speed, but it's a little bit different in phones because we don't have control over the aperture. So we're going to be looking at the shutter speed and the ISO as our two main controls for our manual exposures. Now, capturing an exposure, here's a very kind of crude way of how it actually works. We have our scene that we want to capture. We have our camera lens and we have our aperture here within the lens. Light passes through the lens, through the aperture. So that's our light passing through here, and it is passed on, it's moved on, it's focused onto our image sensor, and our exposure is created. And that is a very basic way of how it all works. We have our scene, light passes through the light, through the aperture, through the lens, is focused to a point, it's projected onto our image sensor, and the image sensor exposes the light for as long as it needs by using shutter speed to get the correct exposure. When we are working in auto modes, it does all of this itself. It works out everything in its computer brain to make sure that the correct amount of light is in the image. But as we know, it can sometimes get it wrong, and we can also control it then ourselves if needs be. But it takes a little bit of work, a little bit of practice, which is exactly what we're going to be learning later on in this course. Now, another very important term to get familiar with is resolution. Resolution, and again, I'm sure you've come across this word before. It's used when it comes to anything involving images. So if you're watching television, or say you're playing games on your PC or anything like that, you're going to be very, very familiar with this term. Basically, our photographs, any digital image, it's made up of pixels. Okay, so pixels are basically these little square blocks that create our images. The amount of pixels is known as resolution. So the amount of pixels that we have in any digital image is known as its resolution. 1 million pixels is a megapixel. So you might have seen this on your phones. I've got 21 MP. That means you've got 21 million pixels. More pixels means great zoom capability. It means you can crop in very, very closely on a photograph. It does not mean a better looking photo. So how we work out our resolution is that pixels are multiplied by height, by width. So in other words, if we have 4,000 pixels going up and we've got 6,000 pixels going across, we multiply those together. That equals 24 million pixels, or 24 MP. Now, pixels can only ever be one solid color or tone. Now, in this example, I've just kind of created a basic version of it, just a simple kind of visualization of it. But in reality, in our images, if you were to zoom very, very closely in to the point where you could see the pixels, they will only ever be one color or one shade. No matter how hard you look, it'll only ever be one solid color or tone. Pixel size is determined by the image sensor size as well. So you might be wondering, well, if my phone has 42 megapixels and my camera has 18 megapixels, does that mean that the phone is going to take a better quality photograph? That's simply not true, because there's a difference in the actual physical size of the pixels. Larger pixels will produce a better quality photograph. We'll also have lots of other different effects and that, things that we'll speak about at a more advanced stage. So the actual size of the pixels does become a factor in image quality. But again, it's going to be very, very difficult to see that nowadays. It would only be at a very high-end professional level that someone might see the difference. But for the majority of us photographing, we'll never, ever see the difference. Now, so with all of that in mind, let's have a look at a phone. Lots of different settings available to us here, as we can see on it, and we can break down exactly what each of these little symbols that are on the phone. So hopefully this looks something like a phone that you're using at the moment, a similar array, a similar display on it. Let's break down each of these little symbols. So the first one we're going to start off with are our guidelines. So we can see that we have this kind of grid here on the phone, and set to the rule of thirds, something we'll have a look at in lesson 3, a compositional guideline. And it is just that. It's just a guideline to help you to make sure that your photographs are straight and that you can kind of place and compose the photograph to a way that is aesthetically pleasing. Beside that, we have our resolution. So we just spoke about it there. We can see in this case it's a 16 megapixel camera. Below that, we also have our aspect ratio. Again, we'll speak about that in lesson 3. That is the shape of the photograph. In this case, it's a widescreen shot. Beside that, we've got our ISO. We'll speak about ISO again much later on in the course. It's set to 400 at the moment. Don't worry about what that number means right now, but we can see here that the camera has gone ahead and set it to 400, which would actually probably be a little bit low in a scene like this. Beside that, we have our memory. So we've got our memory card, so it's indicating where the images are going to be stored. We can see how many images are also left available to us as well. Beside that, we can see that we're in still image mode. So, that will change if we change the mode, if we were, say, recording instead. We have a quick record button. So if we want to quickly take a video, we just simply press that button. We have our exposure button. We press that one to take the photograph. We have our front camera here if we want to switch it around and take a selfie. Some phones will also display what is known as a histogram. This is a much more advanced setting. This will show you your exposure values. So this is something for a much more advanced stage. We can use the histogram to read the exposure without even having to look at the image to make sure that everything is correctly exposed. Over on the other side, we have our settings. If we quickly want to change settings, I can maybe change the photograph to black and white, maybe try out a few different filters, etc. We have our flash option. In this case, it's set to auto flash. In other words, the camera will determine whether or not it needs the flash for the scene. And then we also have our mode, and it's set to program our pro mode at the moment. Now, just one thing I failed to mention there as well. Obviously, within the center of the frame, we've got that yellow block. That is where we focus. So we can change our point of focus by simply touching the screen and choosing where we wish to focus from.